Hello everyone and welcome back. In our last video, we created a structure called messenger where we had the information of the ID, name, message, from, and to. And in this part, we are going to create a function so that we can create this structure using this function. First thing to know about functions, we declare them like we declare functions in Rust. But if you don't know Rust again, don't worry, it's going to be easy. For the functions, I'm going to say public entry fun. And this part indicates that I'm creating a function. With the fun keyword, I mean the function. And with the public keyword, it means that this is a public function. It can be accessed by other modules or from the front end. So anyone can access this function. And with this entry keyword, I said front end can access this function, and this comes with this entry keyword. It means that this is an entry function, and we can call this outside from this contract, like from our front end. So once we are going to change some data on the blockchain and we need a function for it, we can use this entry keyword. We can create entry functions so that these functions can be called from outside. We can actually execute the transaction. One important note about this enter function is that these functions cannot return any values. So with the enter functions, again, we are not going to return any values, and we are going to identify them with this entry keyword. Next, let's give a name to our function. I'm going to say create messenger, and then it's going to take a couple of parameters. The first parameter we need is the name of the messenger. And this is going to be a vector of U8 because, as you remember, we don't have string, but we are going to get our name as a vector. So from the front end, it can come as a string, but here it's going to be treated as this vector. And inside this function, we are going to convert it to a string. So don't worry about it. We have the name. We need the message. It's also going to be a vector of U8. Next, we are going to have to, so we can identify whom we are going to deliver this message, and this is going to be an address. Since it's an enter function, again, we are not going to return any value. But if we were going to return any value, I would put the semicolon here, and then I would give the type that we are going to return. For an example, if we are returning an address, then I would type an address here. If we are returning U8, I would put U8 here. So that's how we can indicate what value we are returning. But since it's an enter function, I'm going to return no value. Now it looks like we are ready to write our logic for our function, but we are actually missing something. What we are missing is the transaction context. And we are also going to need this for this entry functions. So to sum up, we need three things for entry functions. We need to remember three things for entry functions. First, remember to write the name entry in the beginning of the function. Then we cannot return any value with these functions. And for the last part, we need to add the transaction context as the last parameter to our functions. So what is this transaction context? So this transaction context is actually what it sounds like. So when I make a transaction, I also send some information like which address is making this transaction and how much SUI token that I put in this transaction and a couple more information. So this transaction context is going to bring up some information so that we can work with in our functions. To use it, first I need to import it. And for that, I'm going to say use, and it's going to be from SUI. I will say tx context. Next, we are going to say self and tx context. So again, don't worry about this imports. As we move along, we are going to explain it more. At the same time, just be used to writing this imports. So if you are also creating these functions, also creating this code with me, I think it's a very good practice. You can get used to writing this because like even though I read a lot these couple of code, after writing for myself a couple of times, it gets much, much better. Now let's create our function. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a messenger. I'm going to call it messenger, and it's going to be equal to the messenger. By the way, we are creating our variables with the let keyword. We don't say int or something that in the beginning because we are actually identifying it with a semicolon later if we want it. So I can also say this. My messenger variable will be a messenger, So here I identify which type is my messenger variable, but it's not mandatory. Now inside this function, we need to fill up a couple of fields. The first field that we are going to fill is the ID one. And that's a special one because we said that this ID is unique for this one. And then we are going to store our variable using this ID. But how we can create a unique ID? The good answer is we are not going to create a unique ID. We are going to use a unique ID from Sui. So for that, I'm going to say object new, and I will pass the transaction context here. So let's see what we did. First, we used the object library here, and under the object library, we said new, and we gave the transaction context here. And now I just remember that we forgot to put our transaction context. I'm going to say CTX, and it's going to be type of TX context. We are going to see this later, but mute means that we are actually going to alter this variable. So if I have a variable, I'm just going to read, but I'm not going to change, then I don't need to put the word mute here. Because mute means mutable, so we are going to change this variable. If I have a variable like this, it means that I will not make any changes and I will just read the data. But for the transaction context, we put the mute here. So again, later in the functions, we are going to see how to use the mutable versions and the immutable versions. So don't worry about it yet. Just know that with the transaction context, we are using mute. We also have a reference here. What does this reference mean? In Sui, we work with the ownerships. Again, if you're coming from the Rust, it's kind of like the same concept, but if you don't know the Rust, it's going to be a little bit new, but not very complicated. In Sui, we work with the ownership. It means that I have a variable and I have its ownership in my function. And as you know, when the function completes, then we don't have that function. It just appears in our code for a second, then it makes its jobs, and then it goes away. By the time it goes away, if I already own that variable, then the function goes, the variable will also go. Instead of directly giving the variable, what I can do is that I can actually point it. And let's say this is the variable. Instead of giving this, I will give this finger so that this finger points to this variable. So whenever I look for this finger, I can find the variable. So in this way, with the reference, and the reference is this one here. So with the reference, instead of giving this, I'm giving that. And this shows this, and I can actually do my work from here. I can change this. If this is mutable, like we have it here. If this is immutable, I can just read it. But the idea is I have my variable here, and I have a pointer here, and this pointer is going to point this variable. We call it a reference in Move and in Rust. That's the basic ideology. And once I give this finger to the function and not my hand, when the function finishes, what I'm going to lose is this finger, the reference. I can always create a new reference since I still got the variable here. So we are going to work with references in the functions because if I actually give the value to the function, when the function finishes, I'm going to lose that value, lose that variable, and which I don't want it to. But in some specific cases, I may want it to, like deleting an object. And in those cases, we are going to pass directly the object instead of the reference because like after that point, we won't have the object anyway. So we have to actually pass the object. Again, we are going to see them more. But for the time being, with the functions, what we have is an enter function. Enter functions can actually change the data on the blockchain and we can call them from the front end. We cannot return any values with these enter functions and we need to give the transaction context to work with them. Also, our variables can have a reference or themselves directly. If they have a reference, then we can work with them in the function, but we won't lose the value. But if we literally give the value without the reference, then we are going to lose the value at the end of the function. Also, we can get the parameters two different ways, either mutable or immutable. If you don't say anything, then it's immutable. But if we say mute in the beginning, then it means mutable. For an example, if I have a variable called Simon, and if I want to change the name of this variable, I want to make Simon.name equals something else, then I need to get this as a mutable reference because I'm going to change the name of Simon. But if I'm just going to read the name, let's say my function returns the name of Simon, which is pretty obvious, but stick with me. If we return the name from Simon, then what we need to have is just the immutable reference, so that through that reference, I can get, all right, the name is Simon, then I will get this name. But if I want to actually change the name, I'm going to change something. So it needs to be mutable. Because mutable means that I can change something. Immutable means that it can't be changed, as the word meaning. This is the crash course on the functions, but don't worry, as we work with them, it's going to get easier. So for my public entry function, we said that the name is create messenger. We have a couple of parameters as we talked, and for the first field, we created an ID and we gave the object new function from the object in SUI. And for the parameter inside this function, we gave the transaction context. The next one is the name. For the name, I will say string, and from string, I'm going to call UTF-8, and I'm going to pass the name. What it does is it takes this vector of U8 and it converts it to a string. Since we are expecting string here, I'm converting my vector to a string with the UTF-8 function from the string. Next, we have the message, and we are going to do the same thing to the message. We are going to say string UTF-8 and the message. Next, we have from, and this as you can see, we don't have the from in the parameters. That's because we are going to make it from the caller. So if I'm the one who is calling this function, then my address is the from address. If someone else is John is the one who is actually creating this transaction, then John is the one who is sending this message, so that we can have a safe way to send messages. But how can I get the address that is calling this function? The answer is transaction context. I will go to transaction context, and from transaction context, I'm going to call the sender, and inside the sender, I'm going to give this transaction context, and it's going to give me the address. I think it's a very fair deal. Next, we have to, and this is where we are going to send the message, and it's the same name as the parameter. And I'm not going to change anything. So basically what I'm going to do is to. So instead of writing the same thing as the name and the value here, what we can do is, instead of this one, we can have just this. And that means that we have the value in the parameters with the same name here. As you can see, we have the 2. So instead of 2, we would have 2. With this, we can actually create our structure. And let me put a semicolon here. Now we have our messenger object here. We created the object with this ID. Now what we need to do is we need to transfer this object to the owner, because who is going to own this object? So in Sui, instead of addresses, we work with objects, because in general, addresses are the basis for the blockchains. For example, we say that this address has this address has that. But in here, we are working with objects lots of the time. For this part, who owns the object? For this question, we are going to send this object, transfer this object to the caller of this message, so they can actually have this object. So to do that, we are going to use a special function from Sui, which is the transfer function. And again, we need to import this function. For that, I'm going to say use Sui, and from Sui, I'm going to call transfer. With this transfer function, we are going to send our object to the owner. And we have a little error here, unbound model alias, and what we need to do is we need to create a semicolon here, say self. Now the error is gone, like magic. It says in the function invalid return, but we haven't returned anything. So now to transfer, I'm going to say transfer, and from transfer, I'm going to call the function transfer. I know it's a great name, but we also have other functions like the public transfer, so it's going to make sense once we see the public transfer. And inside this, I'm going to say I want to pass my messenger that I created here. I want to transfer this. So the first parameter that we are going to use is the object that we are going to transfer. And the second parameter is the address that we are going to transfer this to. And to get the address, we can say transaction context sender, and inside the sender, again, CTX. So this is going to transfer our object. We can create a separate sender here. If I say like let sender equals TX context, I call the sender and CTX here. And instead of this, I can call the sender directly like this. So it's going to be easier to see. But since it's used a lot, this transaction context sender CTX, I want us to also use it like this so that we can get more familiar. So again, we created our first function. And if you look at what we actually did, I know like I talk more than I write at the moment, but if you look what we did is I think we actually did something spectacular with a little bit of code. What we did is we actually created an asset on the blockchain. So this messenger is basically like an NFT because it's not fungible. You cannot give this partially to anyone. It's just one object and it's unique on the blockchain with its ID. And we also created a function to create this messenger. So here we are creating the messenger and then transferring this messenger object to the transaction sender. So basically, the sender actually has an NFT as this messenger. So it's that easy to actually work with assets and NFTs in Sui. And we are going to also create this more and more. But for the time being, that's all for this lesson. Thank you very much, and I will see you on the next one.